Welcome to a Uranium Report for February 2022. I released this report first for the members at myfinancesteacher.org, and sometime in early March I will also release this report to the viewers on YouTube. So if you're interested in more frequent updates on a range of assets, anywhere from cryptocurrencies to precious metals, from energies to general stock markets and other commodities, join us at myfinancesteacher.org. Coming back to our uranium report, let's first have a look at the charts. Looking at the price of uranium, the history tells me that usually uranium follows these cycles that last for an average of 162 days since the mid of 2019, but the duration varies quite a lot, anywhere from 104 days, that's been the shortest cycle within this period since the middle of 2019, to the longest cycle within this period lasting for 249 days. So anyway, the average is around just under half a year so far, and it seems to me there is a pretty good chance that the previous cycle finished at the very beginning of 2022. Yeah, of course, there is always a chance that we will have one more dip down to this 200-day moving average before a new cycle rally starts in earnest. Nobody does know the future. Perhaps that cycle that started in August last year is going to continue down into the correct cycle low over the next few days. As I said, nobody knows the future, but the likelihood is that the cycle finished several weeks ago at the beginning of 2022. So we are 51 days into a new cycle. We've seen the price actually retrace close enough to the cycle low from early January. And RSI has actually bumped up all the way up to around 70 before coming down again to nearly touch that oversold levels a couple of weeks ago. And we have seen similar behavior in one of the previous cycles in early 2021. So that's not something out of the ordinary. We might still see this cycle continue higher from here. Forgetting about cycles for a moment, just looking at what's been going on for the last year or so, uranium price has gained quite a lot. It's nearly doubled just since early 2021. So of course, a bit of a cool down is to be expected. Some sort of a consolidation triangle perhaps, and usually triangles are continuation patterns. So before the triangle, we see price rising, we see price doubling in around less than a year. So perhaps this longer-term trend is likely to continue over the next year. Next, let's have a look at URA. Over the last year or so, it has been respecting this 50-day moving average quite consistently, bouncing from either side, from above or from below this 50-day moving average. With the most recent bounce being just a couple of weeks ago in early February, we see this bounce from the convergence of resistance factors from this 50-day moving average as well as the 200-day moving average. And as I expect, the uranium cycle has finished a few weeks ago. Similarly, I think the uranium producers, or most of these constituents within URA are uranium producers, have also finished their cycle over here sometime in the second half of January. And as uranium price is likely to break out of that consolidation triangle, URA will eventually break through the 50-day moving average, followed by breaking through the 200-day moving average. We see a death cross over here, but as I mentioned in some of my older videos, to be honest, I haven't really paid much attention to death cross in history. Looking back at history, there are plenty of examples where the death cross wasn't actually followed by a further significant decline in prices of a range of assets. In some of my older videos, I often looked at death cross in Bitcoin prices. Over the last few months, though, URA has already dropped quite substantially from over 31 to under 19. And again, this sort of correction would be expected, as over the last year URA has gained quite a lot. Even from early 2021, it had doubled in prices into late 2021. So a bit of a correction was of course quite likely. And if you look at the pandemic low, in March 2020, URA was around $7. So from $7 to $31, that's over 300% gains. So of course a bit of a correction is not something extraordinary here. But I do think that a new rally is coming up pretty soon. And that's just looking at the technicals. On the fundamentals, or for longer term, the picture I think is even more attractive. So let's have a look at the fundamentals, starting with the demand and supply balance. At least for 2022, according to UXC, the demand for this year is expected to be somewhere around 200 million pounds, whereas the supply, consisting of production at 135 million pounds, secondary supply at 15 million pounds. So the total supply is expected to be around 150 million pounds. That is a deficit of 50 million pounds. That's a huge deficit because that's 25% of the annual demand. But one might argue that a big part of that demand is actually financial demand, such as Sprott Uranium Trust, and then don't actually use up the uranium to produce electricity. So eventually, if not this year, but eventually, some of this uranium might actually contribute back to the supply. So even if you subtract this financial demand for uranium from total demand, this still reduces demand by only 37 million pounds, meaning that demand is still expected to exceed supply this year by around 13 million pounds. I think it's likely to be enough to keep pushing uranium prices higher. Relatively recently, as uranium prices have recovered, Cameco has restarted the production from its McArthur River. But interestingly enough, they've promised to limit the production down to 15 million pounds per year from McArthur River, which is a whole 40% below their licensed capacity. So this is an interesting factor because on one hand, this could be bullish for uranium prices going into the future as the supply is limited to some degree. But on the other hand, there are also some risks in this same factor as well, because Cameco is not going to be at the limits of its production, so it could relatively easily ramp up production in future if they choose to do so. Similarly, as the McArthur River is opening up, adding to production, at the same time, Cameco is actually also reducing its production from Cigar Lake from currently 18 million pounds per year down to around 13.5 million pounds into 2024. Or again, as they have promised. If they keep the promises, it's going to be bullish for the uranium prices, but on the other hand, if prices do get out of hand, there could be some risks of sharp corrections if Cameco can easily ramp up the production. Similarly, with Kazatomprom, the largest uranium producer in the world. So far, Kazatomprom has actually reconfirmed again their commitment to limiting the production level to 20% below their licensed capacity, all through 2022 and even into 2023. But the president of Kazakhstan recently mentioned that he would like to see taxes on miners, including uranium miners, presumably, those taxes, he would like to see those taxes rising. So is that going to push Kazatomprom into just extracting more uranium to prop up their cash flows if the taxes actually increase? This still remains to be seen. Again, as I mentioned, Kazatomprom have reconfirmed that they're going to stick to the limited production levels. But this also does represent some sort of a risk that's not likely to play out over the next few weeks, but might actually play out over the next few months. Next, looking at the long-term supply contracts of uranium to utilities, to power plants basically that consume uranium to produce electricity, we see that over the next few years, say over the next 5 years into 2027, according to the UXC, half of the demand from power generators is not going to be covered by at least currently existing long-term contracts. Of course, this is going to be fixed over the next perhaps year or two. The utilities are going to sign new long-term contracts with producers to cover a greater percentage of their future demand for uranium. And that means that we're likely to see a much stronger additional demand for uranium over the next perhaps a couple of years. And actually, even more recently, the long-term contracting and negotiating has already picked up. So perhaps that is a very bullish sign, and maybe the uranium sector is getting ready to come out of its recent cool down lasting over the last couple of months. Now, looking even further into the future, recently China announced its plans to build 150 new reactors within the next 15 years. As far as I remember, by the time of my previous uranium report from September 2021, have a look at that on my YouTube channel, by the way. The link is down in the description. If memory serves well, China was planning to build perhaps only 50 to 60 new reactors within the next 15 years. At the moment, the data shows that China plans a whole 150 new reactors within the next 15 years, which is quite a lot. That's actually more than the whole world has built over the last 35 years. And additionally, recently China announced that they're going to tie up $440 billion as future investments into nuclear power generation. So again, perhaps not necessarily this year, but over the next few years, this is going to add substantial demand for uranium. And in the long term, I'm really bullish on uranium. And together with the members at myfinancesteacher.org, we have already actually accumulated quite a nice large position in uranium sector. Coming back to the Chinese plans though, by 2035, these 440 billion of investment commitments are expected to create something around 200 gigawatts of power generation. Another huge potential for the uranium sector is what's going on in EU right now. Nuclear is, of course, a fuel source that is capable of baseload electricity generation, and it's generally emissions-free. So the European Union is getting close to announcing uranium as a sustainable source of energy. This classification or this taxonomy is, I think, very likely to take place from the beginning of January in 2023, unless the European Council before that rejects this proposal. But in that case, that would require a whole 20 member states out of the European Council. And another possibility is for the European Parliament to reject that proposal, in which case, again, 353 members of the Parliament would be required. So I think it's much more likely that the proposal is going to go through and uranium will be classified as a sustainable source of energy in Europe from January 2023. So that, I think, will be an amazing driver into late 2022, early 2023. So you do want to get positioned for that possibility. And on more details for positioning, again, consider joining us at myfinancesteacher.org. Another interesting development over the longer term, rather than a development this year, is a quick development of small reactors, which again is likely to add substantially to future demand for uranium over the years to come. And also over the years to come, as well as over the last few years, we've seen old coal-fired power generators, power plants, retiring. And they are likely to be replaced by cleaner sources of energy, including uranium, again adding substantially to a future demand perhaps over the next few years. So these are all longer-term drivers. And to emphasize again, in the longer term, uranium prices are very likely to be substantially higher. Moving on to what's going on over the last few months though, looking at Sprott uranium purchases back in late 2021 through November and December, the purchases were relatively low at only about 300,000 pounds of uranium. But in January and only in the first half of February, so only in a month and a half so far in this year, Sprott uranium purchases came at 4.6 million pounds. That's a substantial increase, again, very likely to push uranium prices over the next couple of months. And another very interesting driver over here is that Sprott has applied for listing on the New York Stock Exchange. At the moment, of course, Sprott uranium is listed in Canada. The paperwork is, of course, likely to take some time, and if it's approved, I think it's likely that listing on the New York Stock Exchange will be approved. In either case, if this listing is approved, perhaps it's going to take a while, and that's also likely to be a noticeable driver, perhaps into late 2022. Next, looking at premiums of Sprott Uranium Trust. That's the difference between the price per share over the net asset value. Looking at premiums is perhaps interesting because Sprott buys more uranium whenever there are premiums above 1%. So the red bars on the chart show that there are no premiums, instead there are discounts when the share price is below net asset value per share. And the green bars represent premiums over here. We see that through late 2021, there were quite substantial discounts going into even negative 9% or 9% discounts. But since then, into early this year so far, we've seen less of those discounts and a bit more of premiums, so perhaps things are recovering a little. So if it is the case, if premiums are likely to continue over the next few months, that's going to add more pressure for larger Sprott uranium purchases, which is again another possible bullish driver. Next, similarly, let's have a look at purchases of URA and URNM. Instead of purchasing uranium, those would purchase the shares of their constituents, mostly, say, uranium producers. And again, late 2021, URA and URNM were actually selling some of the shares of their constituents. The selling came even as low as around $9 million in some of the days in early December last year. But since then, into early this year, we see URA and URNM actually buying more shares of their constituents. And this additional buying comes relatively close enough to this January low in URA. So perhaps the smart money is starting to position themselves back into uranium after this few months of correction, which is also somewhat of an interesting sign over here. So there's my uranium report for you for February 2022. Let me know what you think about uranium as well as energy sectors in general. Let's have a bit of a discussion going on. We can all learn a little from some exchange of ideas. For now, have a nice day and bye-bye.